Chapter 1. Shadows of a Small Town. In 1997, the town of Wilmington, North Carolina, still carried the quiet rhythm of Southern life. Streets lined with oaks and maples created shaded corridors, where houses with wraparound porches and white fences gave the illusion of simplicity and safety. It was a place where neighbors knew one another's schedules, where church bells marked Sundays, and where whispers traveled faster than the morning newspaper. Within this environment, Sarah Donovan believed she lived a stable, predictable life. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman certain about her marriage, her home, and the man she had chosen years earlier. Her husband, Daniel, was a contractor who often spoke of long projects and distant meetings. His departures had become part of the rhythm of their household, like the turning of seasons. Sarah had long trusted the routine. Daniel would leave before dawn, suitcase in hand, and she would prepare breakfast for their daughter before heading to her work at the local library. The repetition of these patterns was soothing, convincing her that all was well. Yet beneath the comfort, subtle cracks had begun to form, invisible to outsiders but faintly perceptible to her. There were the late returns, the vague explanations, and the way his eyes sometimes shifted when she asked for details. She silenced those suspicions, dismissing them as products of her own overthinking. The quiet town around her reinforced this illusion of security, as though betrayal could not coexist with magnolia blossoms and neatly mowed lawns. One evening in early autumn, the first true chill of the season carried a different weight. The air felt heavy, as if the quiet of Wilmington concealed something darker. Sarah noticed Daniel leaving with an unfamiliar urgency. His movements lacked the casual rhythm she had come to expect. Instead of heading toward the highway that led north to Raleigh, he steered his car west, down a 2-lane road that threaded through fields and patches of pine forest. Sarah followed in her own car, her pulse accelerating in sync with the headlights cutting through the dusk. The neat geography of her life began to distort with every mile. The drive pulled her away from the safety of her neighborhood into the anonymity of another town. Streetlights became sparser, and the sight of gas stations and diners gave way to stretches of quiet houses where porch lights flickered on against the deepening sky. Sarah gripped the wheel more tightly, her mind a storm of denial and dread. She told herself there might be a reasonable explanation. A worksite he had not mentioned, a client meeting delayed until evening. But her instincts, sharpened by years of subtle unease, told her the truth was less ordinary. When Daniel's car slowed, she turned off her headlights to avoid detection and kept a cautious distance. He pulled into the driveway of a modest white house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Garden lanterns glowed faintly along the walkway, illuminating a neat lawn and a porch decorated with children's toys. The scene struck Sarah with the weight of a revelation. This was not a construction site or a temporary stop. It was a home, alive with the quiet signals of permanence. She parked several houses away, hidden by shadows, and watched through the windshield as Daniel emerged from his car with no sign of fatigue or urgency. His posture softened as he approached the front door, a shift she had never noticed when he returned to their own home. The door opened, and a woman's figure appeared, silhouetted by the warm light spilling out from inside. Daniel stepped forward with a familiarity that left no space for doubt. Sarah's chest tightened, her breath shallow, as she watched him lift a small child into his arms with practiced ease. The child's tiny hands clung to his shirt as he smiled down, a smile of warmth she had not seen directed at her in years. In that single moment, everything she thought she knew collapsed into silence. Sarah sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. The sound of laughter drifted faintly across the quiet street, mingling with the distant hum of cicadas. Her mind resisted the reality her eyes presented, trying to reconcile the man she loved with the stranger before her. Each second confirmed what instinct had whispered for months. Daniel was not simply a husband working late, not merely a man commuting for business. He was living a double life, splitting his heart, his promises, and his very identity between two worlds. The realization spread through her body like cold water. She could not cry. Not yet. The shock was too vast, too heavy. Instead, she sat in stillness, watching the scene unfold as though she were an outsider, a stranger witnessing someone else's tragedy. The neat architecture of her days, school schedules, church gatherings, family dinners, suddenly seemed meaningless, props in a play she had not known she was performing in. Every lie he had told, every unexplained delay, echoed in her mind with sharp clarity. In that moment, Wilmington's small-town charm felt suffocating. The porches and picket fences seemed to mock her, reminders that even here, beneath the illusion of simplicity, betrayal grew like weeds through cracks in the pavement. Sarah's marriage, once her foundation, had revealed itself as a carefully crafted facade. She sat in her car until the night deepened, unwilling to confront him, yet unable to leave. The shadows of the small town had shown her their secret, and she knew her life would never be the same again. Chapter 2. The house that was not hers. The drive back to her own neighborhood felt endless, though in reality it took less than 20 minutes. The familiar roads blurred past the windshield, their ordinary details stripped of comfort. Porch lights blinked on one by one, families retreating indoors for the evening. Children called home for supper. Sarah noticed none of it. The world outside her car had become a distant hum, a muted backdrop to the heaviness pressing inside her chest. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway of her small house with the white veranda, her body moved only out of habit. She cut the engine, stepped out into the still night air, and climbed the porch steps as though she were returning to a place that no longer belonged to her. Inside, the house carried the faint scent of lavender detergent and last night's baked casserole. It was warm, tidy, and deceptively welcoming. Yet as Sarah set her purse on the entryway table and looked around, the atmosphere felt entirely altered. The walls were lined with photographs that once brought her pride, but now mocked her with cruel irony. There was Daniel on the beach, sunburnt and smiling with his arm around her shoulders. There was Christmas morning, wrapping paper scattered across the floor as their daughter tore into her gifts. There was the family picnic by the Cape Fear River, where Sarah had laughed so hard her cheeks ached. Each frame had once preserved joy, but now each image hissed a quiet reminder that it had all been constructed on a foundation of deceit. Her eyes lingered on the wedding portrait that hung above the hallway. In it, Daniel's expression seemed full of devotion, his gaze fixed on her as though nothing else existed. She had believed in that look for years, building her entire adult life on the faith that it represented truth. Tonight it stared back at her like a taunt, a frozen lie in a gilt-edged frame. She felt no tears rising, no sharp outburst of rage. Instead, her body sank into a heavy numbness, a paralysis of emotion so complete it frightened her. It was as though grief and fury had fused into something unrecognizable, something that left her empty. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching the furniture they had chosen together, noticing details she had once taken comfort in. The worn sofa, where their daughter had curled up with bedtime stories. The dining table polished weekly, around which they had celebrated birthdays. The faint crayon marks on the hallway wall, reminders of a restless toddler's experiments years ago. These objects, once anchors of her family life, now felt alien. She was standing in a house that mirrored her memories, but no longer held her truth. It had become a stage set, carefully decorated to convince outsiders, and herself, that all was well. As she stood in the living room, her mind replayed the countless excuses she had made for Daniel over the years. She remembered the work trips that always seemed to extend by a night or two, the phone calls she could not return because he claimed to be in meetings, the unexplained receipts she found in his pockets, brushed away with a practiced smile and vague answers. She remembered sitting on the bleachers alone during school recitals, explaining to their daughter that her father's job had kept him away, promising that he still loved her, even if he could not be there. With every memory came the sharp realization that she had been his accomplice, not in the betrayal itself, but in smoothing its edges for others. She had made the lie comfortable, not only for him, but for their child and for herself. The weight of this truth pressed more heavily than the betrayal itself. It was not only that Daniel had chosen another life, but that she had enabled his absence by cloaking it in excuses. She had told herself she was preserving the family, protecting her daughter, keeping stability intact. In reality, she had been protecting him, shielding his choices from the consequences they deserved. That awareness burned in her chest, not with the fire of anger, but with the coldness of shame. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed in their shared room. The quilt, stitched by her grandmother, lay neatly spread across the mattress. On Daniel's nightstand rested the book he had been pretending to read for weeks, its bookmark unmoved. She studied these small tokens of domestic normalcy and understood them differently now. They were props in his performance, objects meant to assure her that this was his only home, that his life was rooted here. Yet she had seen him cradle another child in another house. Those images would never leave her. As the hours stretched, she realized she was no longer simply a wife betrayed, but a woman stripped of the illusion that had sustained her. This house, with its neat yard and welcoming porch, had been a symbol of unity. Now it was a shell, a container filled with memories that belonged to a story rewritten by lies. She could still hear the faint echo of her daughter's laughter down the hallway, but even that sound felt stolen, tainted by the knowledge that Daniel's love had never been whole. The numbness persisted as the night deepened. Sarah did not cry, because tears would have implied some hope of release. Instead, she sat in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of moments she had once cherished. Every photograph, every object, every corner of the house whispered the same truth. Daniel had never chosen them fully. He had not chosen loyalty, had not chosen honesty. He had chosen the easier path, the convenience of deception, the comfort of a lie carefully maintained. Chapter 3. Resolve. In small southern towns, truth traveled in the same lanes as rumor, borrowing its speed but not its mercy. Sarah knew this instinctively. She understood that once a story slipped from her hands, the town would reshape it into something small, convenient, and forgettable. She refused to let that happen. The hours after her discovery had left her hollow, but morning hardened the emptiness into purpose. She rose before the sun and moved through the house with a deliberate quiet, aware of each familiar object that had once felt like proof of a shared life. The quilt on the bed, the coffee mug with a chipped rim, the picture frame whose glass she had polished 100 times, none of it defined her anymore. She would define what came next. Resolve arrived not as thunder, but as a steady tide. It carried her toward a sequence of necessary acts. She began by clearing a space at the dining table, sweeping aside an orderly stack of school notices and church bulletins. The table was broad and solid, its surface a faded record of birthdays and homework and Sunday roasts. She turned it into a desk for a different kind of work. A yellow legal pad, a fountain pen, an old address book, a road map unfolded until it covered half the wood. She placed each item with care, creating a geography for decision. She examined the previous months with the precision of a librarian sorting a disorderly archive. She listed dates of unexplained absences, noted mileage on the car's odometer from recent oil change receipts, matched them against the distances on the road map. She pulled crumpled stubs from Daniel's suit pockets that she had tucked in a drawer, fuel purchases from stations west of town, a hardware store loyalty card registered to an address that did not belong to them, a florist receipt from a neighborhood she did not visit. She traced the pattern until it stopped feeling like coincidence. The map, when she finished marking it, looked like a web drawn by a patient hand. She went to the hallway cabinet and retrieved a shoebox that held spare photographs and a small disposable camera, bought for a summer picnic and never used. She slipped the camera into her bag. Evidence, she thought, did not require spectacle. It required clarity. If the story needed proof to withstand the softening influence of gossip, she would have it. The camera was a tool from another decade, but so were promises made before witnesses and rings exchanged in sanctuaries. Both still mattered. At the library, before the doors opened to patrons, she used the quiet of the reference room to read statutes and articles on marital property, custody, and the obligation of support. No one else stood near the legal shelves at that hour, and the pages rustled like dry leaves under her fingers. She copied passages in precise handwriting, underlining phrases that carried weight. She did not seek vengeance in those columns of text. She sought structure. Names could lie, but records told stories without favor. Back at home, she created a small archive. In a manila envelope, she gathered what she had documented: the list of dates, the map with roads highlighted in orange pencil, the receipts, the copied statutes, and a short account written in her neat hand. Time, place, observation. Stated without adjectives. She wrote her name and the date on the envelope's tab. A second envelope received duplicates. She placed one in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser beneath spare linens and carried the other to the bank, where she rented a safe deposit box in a number that meant nothing to anyone but her. She walked out lighter, anchored by the knowledge that truth had been preserved in a quiet vault. Safety came next. She secured the day ahead for her daughter with careful arrangements that required no explanation. Lunch money laid out, a note about an after-school activity written in her even script, a neighbor notified through a courteous card placed under a door. The details were small, but essential. Determination without protection was recklessness. She would not permit her decision to bleed into a child's sense of home. Only then did she let her mind approach the event itself, the birthday that would gather the circle of the other life into one place. She had learned of it indirectly, through soft signals and ordinary preparations observed from a distance. A rented bounce house delivered 2 days early, a grocery run heavier than usual, streamers glimpsed through a window, a bakery box carried with 2 careful hands. The calendar told her it would be Saturday afternoon. The street told her it would be crowded. The weather forecast promised clear skies. She did not think about speeches or scenes. She thought about posture, breath, and timing. She thought about the place where unvarnished facts could not be dismissed. She chose what to wear the way soldiers chose uniforms: simple, practical, without noise. A plain dress in a steady color, low heels that would not betray her footing, a cardigan in case the air cooled under the leafy canopy of the cul-de-sac. She left off jewelry except for a thin ring that had lost its meaning, but not its metal. She placed a small unwrapped gift in a neutral paper bag. Nothing sharp, nothing symbolic, nothing that could be misread as threat or theater. It was an object offered to a child, not to a man. The distinction mattered. She rehearsed nothing aloud. Instead, she disciplined her thoughts the way she disciplined shelves at work. Remove what did not belong. Keep what was necessary. Align everything with the spine facing outward. She would not accuse. She would name. She would not plead. She would declare. She would not argue. She would present. If questioned, she would reference dates. If dismissed, she would hold steady. If shouted at, she would not increase her volume. Truth did not need to outshout lies. It needed to stand where everyone could see it. Her body, still learning this new firmness, reminded her of its age and fragility. She slept in short segments, waking to the hush of the house and the measured tick of the hallway clock. Each waking brought a brief flood of dread, and then the return of resolve, like a tide correcting itself. She ate without appetite, moved without wasted motion, and kept her hands busy when her mind tried to race ahead. She cleaned the kitchen, laundered linens, wiped the glass of the wedding portrait with a steady hand, and then placed it face down in a drawer. She did not smash it. Destruction would have been a spectacle for no one. Removal was enough. She drove once more through the other neighborhood, not to torment herself, but to gather the practical knowledge that would inoculate her against surprise. She noted parking options, the arrangement of the yard, the position of the porch relative to the street, the likely path of guests arriving with gifts. She saw where neighbors might stand in clusters and where children might run in loops. She timed the distance from her car to the front walk and then to a point where she could be seen by anyone who cared to look. She stood for a minute under the shade of a sycamore at the far end of the block and let the sound of ordinary life wash over her until it lost its edge. When she returned home, she placed the disposable camera on the entry table beside the manila envelope and her keys. The objects looked almost random, the way truth sometimes did before it took its proper shape. She walked from room to room and absorbed the house one last time as a place shaped by old assumptions. She paused where the sun fell in narrow bands across the floorboards and allowed herself a single, measured breath that reached the bottom of her lungs. The breath did not erase fear. It simply made room for it beside something larger. By late afternoon, the plan no longer felt like a plan. It felt like a path. Each step had been set in place by the decision that her voice would carry the first telling of what she knew. She understood that the gathering she intended to enter would not welcome her truth, but welcome was not the measure she used anymore. She had chosen a steadier measure, the alignment of her actions with the facts in her possession and the dignity she intended to keep. The town could do what it wished with its whispers. She would walk straight into the center of sound with a quieter thing that did not bend. She turned off the hallway clock, not to stop time, but to remove the ticking that sought to rush her. She picked up the keys, the camera, and the small paper bag. She checked the lock on the back door out of long habit and closed the front door behind her with a careful hand. The house remained upright and orderly in her wake, but it no longer claimed authorship of her story. The decision had already written the opening lines. Chapter 4. The Party with the Clown and Balloons. The neighborhood street shimmered in the heat of a late spring afternoon. The house Sarah had once only glimpsed from afar now stood before her fully alive, animated by the energy of a celebration. The front yard was strung with ribbons of bright colors, and balloons tied to fence posts swayed with each small gust of wind. Children darted back and forth, their shrieks of delight piercing the air, while a clown in oversized shoes twisted balloons into animals, his painted smile reflecting the atmosphere of joy. To any passerby, it was a perfect picture of family happiness. To Sarah, it was a stage where truth waited to be unveiled. She lingered at the gate for a moment, her hand gripping a carefully chosen gift wrapped in cheerful paper. It was not selected with affection, but with a deliberate precision, chosen to look like any other mother's offering, as if she had always belonged among them. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, but her outward composure remained controlled. Every step she took across the grass sounded louder in her own mind, as though the ground itself amplified her presence. Inside the yard, parents stood in clusters, chatting with the ease of familiarity, while the children's laughter filled every pause. A folding table overflowed with plates of cake and bright paper cups, the sugary scent of frosting mingling with the faint trace of grilled food from the kitchen. Sarah noted each detail with the sharpness of someone whose senses had been sharpened by betrayal. Nothing escaped her eyes. The balloons shaped like dogs and swords, the streamers catching in tree branches, the faces turned toward joy as if nothing outside this fence existed. When the door opened, Daniel appeared, no longer a weary traveler from supposed business trips, but a man radiating confidence on his own territory. His expression carried the ease of a host welcoming guests, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a boy whose cheeks still bore smears of icing. For a fleeting second, his face held the same softness Sarah remembered from the early years of their marriage, the warmth that once convinced her of permanence. Then his gaze found her, and everything within him froze. The smile faltered, the casual charm stiffened, and his hand dropped from the boy's shoulder as though burned. A hush rippled through the nearest guests, curiosity sharpening the air. They waited, expecting another routine greeting, perhaps the introduction of a distant relative or family friend. Instead, the silence stretched, broken only by the distant laughter of the clown and the squeak of balloons twisting into shape. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady but quiet, carrying farther than she intended in the sudden stillness. Her words pierced the scene with the weight of revelation, and the faces around her shifted in recognition of something they could not yet comprehend. Murmurs spread quickly, weaving through the crowd like a gust scattering leaves. Conversations faltered, then fell into silence. Children sensed the shift and slowed their play, puzzled by the sudden heaviness that replaced celebration. The clown paused mid-gesture, balloon in hand, his painted grin frozen as he glanced toward the adults. In the span of seconds, joy transformed into unease. Sarah stood in the center of it, unmoving. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She let the stillness of her presence become the loudest sound in the yard. For years, she had been the silent partner, the woman who excused absences, who filled in explanations for her children, who accepted hollow reassurances. Now she was the interruption no one expected, the fracture line cutting through the facade of Daniel's carefully built life. Around her, guests shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided her gaze, others stared openly, their curiosity mingled with a dawning sense of scandal. Whispers grew, soft but insistent, as the truth began to take shape in their minds. The image of Daniel, the devoted husband and father, faltered against the evidence of the woman standing before them. The boy, oblivious to the weight of the moment, tugged at Daniel's hand, but the gesture went unanswered. Daniel's posture betrayed him. Rigid shoulders, clenched jaw, a man cornered without walls. The air felt charged, as though a storm hovered just beyond sight, ready to break. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation. It was filled with the echoes of what could no longer be hidden, a silence that marked the end of illusion. Sarah had not shouted. She had not pleaded. She had simply arrived, carrying the truth of her existence into a world built on deception. And in that moment, the party with its balloons, its clown, and its fleeting laughter became something else entirely. It became the stage for collapse, the place where a family's false image cracked under the weight of reality. Sarah felt no triumph, no relief, only the stillness of inevitability. The performance was over, and every person present now bore witness. The truth had arrived, and nothing in that yard would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. Collapse. The soundscape of celebration fractured into jagged pieces that no longer fit together. Music thinned to a distant murmur, the laughter of children flattened into uncertain noise, and adult voices surged and broke like wind against a cracked window. The woman from the neighboring town stood near the porch with one hand pressed to her mouth, shoulders shaking under the weight of a grief that did not yet have words. Mascara pooled at the edges of her lashes, leaving pale tracks on skin that had expected joy and received exposure. People gave her space, and in giving it, isolated her further. The boy whose name decorated the cake hovered between the porch and the yard. His paper crown slipped sideways, his eyes fixed on adults who could not return him to the safety of minutes ago. Daniel moved as if struggling through thick water, turning from one cluster of guests to another, assembling explanations that crumbled the moment they left his posture. He raised his hands in gestures that aimed at control and landed as pleading. Each attempt to align facts with appearance met the same resistance. The still figure at the gate who had entered without spectacle and altered the air, and the many small, stubborn proofs distributed across the scene. 2 sets of keys on the console table by the open door. A pair of work boots under a bench that did not belong to this address. Children's drawings bearing a surname that matched his, but not hers. A life arranged with the calm repetition of habit. No one spoke loudly enough to drown the new reality. Guests stood at angles that betrayed allegiance or disbelief. Some studied the grass, unwilling to witness. Others watched openly, their faces shifting from curiosity to discomfort to judgment. A few looked toward the driveway, silently measuring their exit. The clown, stranded at the edge of the patio with a limp tangle of balloons, tried to animate a pink dog into existence before letting the uninflated rubber fall into a crate. A breeze picked up and sent napkins skittering over the lawn like little white flags that did not belong to any side. Sarah's determination did not waver, but it did not seek attention either. She stood near the folding table with the paper cups, her hands resting on the small bag she had brought, her shoulders square. The disposable camera in her bag felt weighty for its size. She had not come to create a scene, but she understood that memory is a traitor under pressure. Evidence, quiet and plain, preserved the shape of truth when voices tried to sand it down. When a clear line of sight opened across the yard, she lifted the camera, framed the porch where the banner and the boy and the man intersected, and pressed the shutter once. The small mechanical whir seemed louder than it was, but the sound was brief and final, like a page turned. The woman's sobs thickened the air. A neighbor's wife guided her to a chair, offered a napkin, and set a paper cup of water within reach, then hovered with a helplessness that revealed the thinness of community when it met the steel of truth. The women who had arrived early to arrange streamers now removed them with small apologetic motions, as if restoring order could retroactively correct the day. At the edge of the yard, 2 men lifted the rented bounce house and began dragging it toward the truck, with the slow resignation reserved for storms one cannot outpace. Children sensed that they had been relocated from the center of a party to the edge of an adult problem. They huddled near the fence, wide-eyed, clutching favors that had turned into obligations. A girl rubbed the frosting off her hands, with a concentration that served as a shield. The birthday boy's father, whether named or unnamed in any document, had become a man whose gestures carried the weight of doubling. The child watched him and learned something that would arrive later as language but had already arrived as feeling. A figure can occupy 2 spaces and belong to neither. Guests began to choose, gently at first. A cousin gathered her daughters, passing through the gate with the apology of someone leaving a hospital waiting room. An older neighbor in pressed slacks placed his half-eaten slice of cake on the table with careful precision, aligning it with the paper plate's edge, as though exactness could substitute for courage. A pair of teenage boys moved around with trash bags, collecting plastic forks like scavengers after a parade, eyes averted from the porch. No one slammed doors. Wheels rolled over gravel with the quiet of retreat. Daniel's voice never rose above the pitch of negotiation, but there was a telltale crack at the edge, a frayed thread in the weave of his performance. He pivoted between compassion and logistics, between the house behind him and the woman before him, between the son who waited and the woman at the gate who did not wait anymore. Even the sun seemed to shift allegiance, slipping behind a bank of cloud and dulling the colors that had promised celebration. Balloons bumped each other listlessly, and then tugged at their strings as if asking to be released from a scene they could not redeem. The cake, untouched in the center, began to reflect the temperature of the afternoon. Frosting softened at the edges, letters sank slightly into sugar, and the plastic figurines on top leaned as if bracing against a current. The scene carried 1,000 small dissolves, melting icing, drooping ribbons, the slide of a crown to the grass, a cup tipped on its side leaving a ring on the tablecloth. Collapse rarely declared itself with a single dramatic gesture. It preferred erosion, the steady undoing of details until no one could mistake what had changed. Sarah registered the judgment in certain glances and the gratitude in others, though neither altered the line she had set for herself. She was not here for vindication. She was here for the end of pretense. Each departing car confirmed that the story had moved from private to common knowledge, from his control to the town's inevitable retelling. The path to damage control narrowed with every taillight that disappeared at the corner. The woman on the porch steadied her breathing. The boy's shoulders rose and fell under a too-big t-shirt, and Daniel's hands found his pockets as if the simplest human gesture might restore his authority. A few guests tried to act as bridges, their words soft, and palms turned outward. But bridges cannot span a river that has already changed its course. The host's lawn, carefully mowed that morning, now bore the scuffed tracks of all the recalibrations that had taken place upon it. Footprints overlapped in the trampled grass, spiraling outward from the porch like a diagram of shock. A plastic fork cracked under someone's heel with a sound that felt too loud. the smallest thing announcing itself as broken. One family after another slipped through the gate, with the choreography of people who feared being seen, but feared staying more. The clown, now a man with paint smudged along his jawline, loaded a suitcase of lace-twisted latex into the van and paused with a hand on the door, uncertain whether to offer a wave or simply disappear. He chose disappearance, and the van's engine swallowed the last of the party's artificial cheer. When the crowd thinned to a scatter of loyalists and witnesses, the yard exhaled. The hush that followed had the density of aftermath. The ordinary sounds of the street, the thrum of a distant mower, the faint call of a dog, returned with a cautious step, as if asking permission to resume. The birthday banner hung skewed from one nail, its cheerful font at odds with the slant. In a corner, a gift bag lay on its side, tissue paper blooming from its mouth like a surrendered flag. Sarah did not feel victory. She felt weight redistributed inside her chest, a shift from carrying to setting down. For years, she had managed absences and padded lies with explanations meant for children and neighbors, and even for herself. That labor had ended in the space of an afternoon. The town would build its own versions. The families would calculate their losses, and paperwork would one day place lines around what had occurred. None of that belonged to the yard. The yard only held the moment when a secret failed to hold. She looked once more at the porch where the woman sat, and the boy stood, and the man hovered between them, and she understood that the human cost had not been paid by one account alone. Yet understanding did not equal erasure. The truth had stepped into the open, and the open had done what it always does. It had made space for consequence. The guests, by leaving, had recorded their verdict without raising their voices. The day, by ending, had signed its name. The gate creaked as a final family slipped away. A stray balloon wriggled free and climbed unsteadily into the late light until it was a dim coin against the sky. The yard settled around its new silence. For Sarah, the quiet was not empty. It was the sound of a life no longer arranged around someone else's lie. Chapter 6. Judgment and Retribution. The months that followed unfolded with the steady inevitability of consequence. Wilmington was not a large city, and whispers traveled faster than headlines. What had once been idle admiration for Daniel's success as a contractor shifted into suspicion, then into certainty. At grocery stores, neighbors turned their carts sharply to avoid greeting him. At the bank, clerks handled his transactions with a cool formality. The easy handshakes that had once opened doors now ended abruptly, palms withdrawn as though his touch carried contagion. His double life, once carefully hidden, had collapsed into public record, and the town itself became a jury. For Sarah, the court proceedings were not just a legal process, but a reckoning long overdue. She entered the courthouse each morning with her head high, carrying folders of documents her attorney had assembled. Financial records, travel logs, even receipts that betrayed his careful lies. The courtroom's stillness pressed on everyone present. The judge's gavel was not merely symbolic. It became the rhythm of dismantling the facade Daniel had built. Witnesses spoke of his absences, his inconsistent accounts, the pattern of deception too elaborate to dismiss as error. His second household appeared in testimony not as an accident of the heart, but as deliberate fraud, sustained through falsified financial statements and quiet diversions of shared income. The other woman, once introduced to the community as his devoted partner, arrived to hearings with shoulders slumped, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes. She listened as evidence revealed that she too had been deceived, convinced she was chosen, when in truth she had been arranged as part of a parallel life. Her tears were not those of loyalty, but of betrayal, the sudden understanding that she and her child had been pawns in his architecture of lies. The judge's words struck with finality. Custody of Sarah's daughter was awarded solely to her. The marital home, once a stage for his absences, was secured under her name. Daniel's hidden accounts, unearthed through forensic accounting, were frozen and redirected to repay debts he had concealed. The gavel fell, and with it ended the illusion that he could continue dividing his existence without consequence. When the verdict was read, the silence in the courtroom was almost reverent. Daniel sat hollow-eyed, the lines of stress carving deeper into his face, as though the years of duplicity had finally claimed their due. There was no outburst, no last defense, only the slow acceptance of a man who had exhausted every narrative and found himself reduced to the truth he had spent years avoiding. His colleagues, once allies in business, withdrew quietly, knowing that association carried its own cost. His reputation, once leveraged to secure contracts, now lay in ruins, as contractors and clients alike severed ties. For Sarah, liberation did not arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, in the absence of weight. She returned to her modest house and stood in the doorway, inhaling air that no longer carried the residue of deception. The photographs on the wall remained the same, but they no longer mocked her. They were simply records of moments, and she alone would decide how they lived in her memory. Nights no longer stretched into anxious silence. They were filled instead with the steady breathing of her child asleep down the hall, a sound that grounded her more than any verdict could. The second family drifted away from Daniel, too. At first, there were attempts at reconciliation, efforts to salvage some piece of the arrangement. But when the extent of his duplicity became undeniable, they stepped back, choosing dignity over denial. Their departure was not dramatic. It was the quiet closure of doors, the end of phone calls unanswered, the absence of his name at gatherings. He had tried to hold two worlds, and in the end, both slipped from his grasp. Sarah did not pursue vengeance beyond the walls of the courtroom. She did not need to. Justice, once named aloud, carried its own power. She walked out of the courthouse with papers in her hands, but more importantly, with her own voice intact. The humiliation she had once feared gave way to a deep pride, not in what she had endured, but in her refusal to remain silent. In Wilmington, stories were rarely forgotten, and hers became one retold in hushed admiration, not of scandal, but of strength. The woman who had stood at the gate of another family's home and spoken the truth without trembling. The woman who had faced down deceit, not with rage, but with unshakable dignity. Her story was carried across church pews, neighborhood porches, and quiet coffee shop tables. And in those retellings, she became more than a betrayed wife. She became a reminder of what it meant to refuse erasure. By the time the final documents were signed and Daniel's appeals denied, Sarah had already moved beyond the shadow of his choices. She planted roses in her front yard, their roots pressing deep into the soil of a home that was hers alone. She attended school plays without needing to explain anyone's absence. She laughed again, not in defiance but in ease, as though joy itself had been waiting patiently for her to claim it. There was no revenge in her eyes when she passed him on the street months later. Only the calm of someone who had survived the collapse of lies and stepped into a life built on truth. For the first time in years, she was free, not because he had been punished, but because she had chosen to speak, to stand, and to endure. And in that endurance lay her greatest victory.